We're excited to announce that Jim Campbell Radio has now been unveiled on YouTube. You search Jim Campbell Radio. When you get there, please subscribe. You'll get all our updates. Content is regularly updated, and Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell and Business Talk with Jim Campbell, all of our podcasts are right there for you. All of this new consolidated data, content updated regularly. Jim Campbell Radio. This is Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Dr. Bandy Lee, formerly Assistant Clinical Professor in Law and Psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine, recognized global leader on group violence, dared to take on a president's fitness for office, loses her prestigious position over a tweet. We're talking truth to power today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Bandy's the editor of the bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a presidency, for which she was a guest on our show. And her more recent work, Trump's Mind, America's Soul Profile of a Nation. And I counted, Bandy, this is the 6th time you've been on. Welcome back.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you for having me back.
You know, as I look back, I remember the very first time we had you, and you know, I knew Trump had all these issues and whatever, but this is now, whatever, 2015, maybe even before the first election. And, you know, you were talking about the threat of violence and things that might come out of his presidency, which sounded, frankly, almost nuts to me. And then we finish up 5 years later with an insurrection. Do you have any feeling of vindication along with all the scars that you've picked up?
Oh my, I don't know if vindication is the right word. Sadness, maybe. I mean, the reason why we have expertise, and for me, the value of expertise is that we can analyze things in advance that the layperson may not necessarily see very readily. And we recommend interventions so as to prevent exactly what has happened. And as you noted, my warnings in the beginning sounded a bit crazy because I was extremely worried. And yes, and none of our predictions were far off in any way. In fact, everything fell into place exactly as we feared, and still are falling into place. And that's really a great concern for me.
It's kind of interesting too that even after all this sort of evidentiary material, there still really hasn't been a sort of a universal acceptance that maybe this guy wasn't fit for the job. But anyway, you do have scars that came out of this, and I saw a recent New York Magazine article, and so tell us, why did you leave Yale, or actually more accurately, why did Yale cave in for some reason? And let's just put this in perspective. You have over 100 peer-reviewed articles, edited over a dozen academic books, and have been at Yale for 17 years. Tell us what happened.
Yes, I can't really comment much about the lawsuit because it is ongoing, but I did file a lawsuit because I felt that this was more a societal issue than a personal one. And I feared that eventually, as authoritarianism grew in our society, which for me is a public mental health issue, but that's the perspective I bring, that eventually we will no longer keep with truth, standards, or ethical norms as we would deliberate them in times of non-authoritarianism. Authoritarianism for me means the usurping of authority of the truth or knowledge or expertise on the part of power. And that's why I felt it was necessary for me to take a personal issue and make it public through a lawsuit. For me, an academic affiliation actually is, as you noted, my academic accomplishments are there, and so I could easily find another affiliation. But Yale is the institution I have devoted much of my career to, and have great affection for from my days as a student there. I deliberately chose the institution upon completing residency, even though I was invited to a prestigious position at Harvard Medical School. I chose to return to Yale because I felt it reflected better the principles and values of my grandfather, who was a famous physician of his time in South Korea.
Let's get for people in perspective who don't know what triggered this. Why? And I assume you're talking academic freedom. Give us the reason for why Yale did this. And I know it links back to that Dershowitz tweet. I don't know if that's the main reason, but tell people that, because I don't think most people understand what the story is behind it.
Yes, of course. Let me go back a little and explain. So since 2017, I went public with warnings about Donald Trump, going as far as holding a conference that attracted mental health professionals from all over the world, and then publishing a book about it with some of the most renowned psychiatrists and psychologists in the nation and the country, and all over the world. And Yale was supportive of my right to freedom of speech and academic freedom, at least in terms of what it stated in public. It did ask me to distinguish my views from Yale's views, and I did that throughout all my interviews as much as I could. And it was only 3 years later when I tweeted about Alan Dershowitz, because I was concerned about the spread of symptoms. We had warned that a lack of intervention on the part of the president, that the psychological dangerousness he brought would spread to social, cultural, geopolitical, and civic dangerousness. And that was what I was warning against when I was commenting that some of the characteristics that Alan Dershowitz freely displayed were actually a sign of shared psychosis. Shared psychosis is a phenomenon where if you have a highly mentally impaired individual in an influential position with a lot of exposure to public, you actually see the symptoms spread, even among healthy individuals. Of course, those who already have those characteristics will see them amplified, but you see a spread in a way that goes far beyond rational persuasion or logical rational choice. And that's what I was describing. So Mr. Dershowitz did not like that. He complained to Yale that I was diagnosing him and breaking the American Psychiatric Association's so-called Goldwater rule, even though shared psychosis is not a diagnosis and one does not need to examine an individual personally in order to observe that's actually psychosocial phenomenon. So there was really no change in my speech, but I suppose it was Mr. Dershowitz's complaint that made Yale change its stance, because less than 48 hours later, it came out and asked for a talk with me, and what I thought would be a private talk turned out to be a whole committee, and they called it a committee evaluation, and then decided to dismiss me based on my lack of teaching skills, professionalism, and that seemed odd because my reviews were always top rated, and in fact, when I was teaching a course at Yale College, they often said it was a top course that they've taken in their undergraduate careers. It was the most popular course in the most popular certificate program, which was Global Health Studies, which was the reason why I was invited to teach in other certificate programs, such as education studies. And for my teaching credentials to go from that to being unqualified to teach at Yale was pretty astonishing. an astonishing shift for me to see.
We're talking with Bandy Lee, who's formerly at Yale and has been in the forefront of the duty to warn movement on the fitness of President Trump. All right, we've been talking with Dr. Bandy Lee, formerly of Yale. She's embarking on a new opportunity now. We'll be back right after this for our next segment.
From Philly to Fresno, Brooklyn to Boston, Data Cable Superstars has the best prices on installation of Cat 5 and Cat 6 wiring for cameras, computers, phone, and data, specializing in off-peak installs as to not interrupt your workflow. If this is an I need it done yesterday situation, then it's time to call Data Cable Superstars at 203-942-1427 or go to datacablesuperstars.com. That's Data Cable Superstars, all one word, .com. Data Cable Superstars, where estimates and big ideas are always free.
Would you like to host your own radio program or podcast? Park City Productions 06604 is a Bridgeport, Connecticut-based radio broadcast solutions company. Follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's Park City Productions 06604. Call us at 203-522-8801.
Talking with Bandy Lee, who's formerly at Yale and has been in the forefront of the duty to warn movement on the fitness of President Trump for office. The particular tweet, it's kind of strange that it became so serious out of this, that Dershowitz was, again, denying any role in the Jeffrey Epstein case, and down to the extent of saying, I have a perfect sex life. And that you would respond that that's kind of an odd use of perfect, obviously linking to President Trump's famous, I had a perfect phone call with the Ukraine. Did you mean that intent? And is that worthy of I mean, I assume you were tongue-in-cheek to begin with.
Well, I only comment on public figures, by the way, when they pose a danger to public health, because our responsibility to society overrides our responsibility to powerful political figures or prominent figures in the media. And so, but the danger that they pose is real. And so when Mr. Dershowitz, I wasn't so much commenting on his use of the word perfect as much as what it signified, the level of entitlement, the attacks on any kind of criticism, and the overcompensation by, who has a perfect sex life? I mean, who describes their sex life that way other than to overcompensate? And that reflected for me the kinds of attitudes, symptoms, and in fact, probable delusions on the part of Donald Trump that were posing a danger to society, because the more severe the symptoms are, the more they're driven by emotional compulsion rather than reason and actually override rational thought. And as these symptoms spread, and particularly the delusions, paranoia, and violence proneness, which are particularly contagious phenomena in the psychological realm. And they're all the more dangerous because you do not need physical exposure to acquire these characteristics. And in fact, it functions much like an epidemic or a pandemic in that it's exponential. So we have to stop it before it spreads too widely and detaches our society from reality in ways that we are seeing right now. I've often said that the number one threat to our public health is actually the mental health pandemic that is determining our ability to have a rational public political discourse, affecting our ability to contain the viral pandemic, and also affecting our ability to keep ourselves safe. And all these things are being affected in dangerous ways. We can see from how difficult it is to pass a voting rights bill, something that should be just fundamental to preserving our constitutional rights, and yet we're not able to do something that basic. We are not able to contain the COVID pandemic. Viruses behave the way they behave. If we don't contain them early on and in commensurate ways that they require, they will mutate and spread. And that's exactly what we are observing. Also, our cities are becoming more dangerous. We're seeing violence rates at the level of the 1980s or 1990s. And once again, and this is actually a very dangerous phenomenon that we saw coming. And now with the rise of domestic terrorism, this violence can very easily translate into political violence. And the violent insurrection that we saw at the Capitol may just be a prelude.
This inability to handle the pandemic, which you linked to the mental health pathologies of the countries, are you attributing that to Trump, or is it bigger than that? I mean, what is making this happen?
Well, for a contagious phenomenon to spread, you need three conditions. You need an agent, a virus, or a source, what we call, the primary person with the illness, the actual illness that spreads even to healthy individuals. And so that would be Donald Trump. But of course, he cannot do it alone. He needs a conducive environment. So infections depend greatly on the environment we set up for them. Tuberculosis, for example, spreads in crowded spaces and lack of hygiene. The mental health symptoms that I described spread in environments of high levels of socioeconomic inequality, weakened public mental health, a lack of access to education, to healthcare, to public discourse, to knowledge. These kinds of things all can play a role into the environment that allows these symptoms to spread. And then thirdly, you have to have weakened hosts. In other words, the recipients of these symptoms or effects of spread of symptoms. And that would be a weakened population predisposed with symptoms of their own, or with psychological vulnerabilities that a personality such as Donald Trump could exploit. And once there's a level of pathology, it acts kind of as a symbiosis, in that pathology attracts pathology, and you can't really convince them to adopt healthy measures that would help mitigate some of this spread. And so all these conditions were present. That's what I've just tried to describe in the book that you mentioned, Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul, in that we cannot consider any of these elements in isolation. And we also cannot consider this phenomenon apart from mental health. It has become a mental health phenomenon. It wasn't the choice of mental health professionals to identify this as such. We merely identified what was, in that our political choices or our public health measures or social cultural decisions are now being based on pathology, or mental pathology, I should clarify, to the point where mental health expertise is necessary. We need the input of specialists who deal with mental disease day in and day out. It's reached that level.
Talking with Bandy Lee, who's formerly at Yale and has been in the forefront of the duty to warn movement on the fitness of President Trump for office. All right, we've been talking with Dr. Bandy Lee, formerly of Yale. She's embarking on a new opportunity now. We'll be back right after this for our next segment. Talking with Bandy Lee, who's formerly at Yale and has been in the forefront of the duty to warn movement on the fitness of President Trump for office. Are you describing a cult?
Yes. Well, cults are a prime example of the spread of shared psychosis. It doesn't take always unhealthy individuals to form a cult. Anybody can become a part of a cult, although those who are psychologically vulnerable are more prone to it. But it's not just cults. It could be gangs, street gangs. That's where I got most of my experience from, working in prison settings and being a forensic psychiatrist, working at the interface of psychiatry and criminal justice. I've seen a great deal of this phenomenon in gangs. But we also see it in political personality cults, in cults of authoritarianism, where fascism or authoritarianism spread. And fascism is often mistaken to be a political ideology, but I always try to explain that it is mental pathology in politics. And we can tell that apart by the fact that these characteristics mimic, in fact, follow the same principles of pathology. When an individual falls into pathology, one is no longer making free choices or rational, conscious choices, but rather are being driven by emotional drives, compulsions in ways that are predictable by the disease. They become rigid, they become defensive, unamenable to facts or evidence or rational persuasion, and eventually they become self-destructive. That's why it's important to distinguish disorder from rational choice. Of course, the person falling into disorder will insist, in fact, more adamantly try to what they are choosing is of their free will, but in fact, it's the disease having taken over their minds. The reason we know this is because, well, when we get to the unfortunate circumstance of having to hospitalize people by against their will, they go kicking and screaming, and as a treater, it's often a very heartbreaking situation to put a patient in, and you wonder if your rapport with them has been damaged for life, but they actually return thanking you, extraordinarily grateful for freeing them from the captivity that they were in without knowing through the mental pathology. And it's because of these repeated experiences of those who have undergone this experience of hospitalization and often treatment against their will, that we do make that exception in a country that so values civil liberties. I mean, it is an intervention that is needed to enhance the individual's ability to have their freedom of mind and their civil freedoms. And that's what we are not allowing the population, by barring mental health professionals from commenting on what is so familiar to us and what we know so well, what we need to do to intervene with and to correct. And by not accepting any other theory than that what these groups of people desire is another political ideology, or these viewpoints are simply exercising their political freedom or making a rational choice without acknowledging the pathological characteristics that they display and self-destructive characteristics.
So if I exponentially blow this up to the country, are you talking about from individual pathology into, say, groups or cults or whatever? Now you're talking about we're talking about some rather huge percentage of the country. I mean, as we say, 70% of Republicans believe the election was stolen still, which certainly seems to fall under kind of what you're talking about, given that there's no basis in fact for it. How does society address this?
Yes, it's absolutely fixable, which is the reason why I have not ceased to try to speak up, even though the American Psychiatric Association intervened and shut us out of all public media, apart from, those who persist, such as yourself. But it's critical for the population to be educated about these phenomena, about how mental pathology manifests and how it can be contagious, that psychological symptoms can be contagious too, just like physical symptoms. It depends on which kind and what characteristics they carry. And that there are ways to intervene that are science-based and based on experiments that we have done with shared psychosis over 150 years. It's not an unknown phenomenon. It's been called different things. Carl Jung called it mass psychosis or a psychic epidemic. It's been called folie à millions when it affects an entire population, madness by the millions. More recently, it's been called shared psychosis in English-speaking countries, or we can name the symptoms: induced delusions, induced paranoia, induced violence. And so it's a well-known phenomenon that we're doing our best to deny at this moment, which also indicates the poor state of mental health we are in as a nation, because denial of the illness is also a symptom of mental illness, unlike other forms of illness.
I tell you what to me is the hard thing for me to figure out is I hear what you say because I've experienced it myself, which is facts, logic, science, truth, or whatever does not work on trying to convince someone of this. I had someone who we were talking about the deficit and why it was going up so quickly under Biden. And I said, well, do you realize Trump increased the deficit $7.8 trillion in 4 years? And the person just says, where'd you make that up? Did you get that out of the Lincoln bedroom? Literally. So I cut and pasted from Google, from searching the exact dollar amount of what the increase had gone up. And the guy just said he still didn't believe it. And that's what you've just said. So I have a hard time figuring out how you address shared psychosis if rational truth and don't work.
What you do are threefold. In other words, you remove the offending agent, that is the highly mentally symptomatic individual in an influential position. You remove them from exposure to the public. So you remove the exposure and the shared psychosis goes away. It's a very dramatic phenomenon when we observe it in households, in gangs. You hospitalize the primary individual with the illness and the other persons who almost looked like they had the same illness. In fact, they actually do. Individuals in the household of a schizophrenic patient look like they have schizophrenia. You cannot tell them apart until you do a detailed history. But once you remove the primary person with the illness, all the secondary individuals return to their baseline or to normal. And it's a very dramatic phenomenon. That is the treatment for shared psychosis, removing exposure. Now, secondly, you have to improve the environment that gives rise to this strong attraction between these individuals, and that is to regulate and remove sources of propaganda and inculcation of false ideas. The propaganda sources have proliferated in the right-wing media, especially since Rush Limbaugh and Fox News, and you could see the psychological techniques that they're using to basically gaslight the nation, manipulate minds, and to brainwash. It's not an exaggeration to say it's a form of brainwashing. And then thirdly, we need to fix the socioeconomic conditions that give rise to the psychological vulnerabilities in the first place. We often think of economic deprivation as being simply material, but the psychological injuries that it does is non-negligible. In fact, we see that economic deprivation, especially relative deprivation, because we're going back to the psychological effects, can create a lot of stress, impairments in psychological and physical functioning in their overall state of health, and can diminish lifespans, life expectancy by decades. So fixing the socioeconomic conditions, namely inequality, which in the field of violence studies we name structural violence, because it truly does give rise to disease and death and injury. It is a form of violence. And as long as we are committing this kind of widespread violence against the population, we will continue to see these phenomena.
All right, we've been talking with Dr. Bandy Lee, formerly of Yale. She's embarking on a new opportunity now. We'll be back right after this for our next segment. Now, the thing is that the treatment sort of is almost fascistic in the sense that remove the agent, that's get rid of Trump or whatever, control the dissemination of essentially brainwashing material. That's Fox, whatever you want to call that, conspiracy, misinformation. But we don't live in a society, right, where we can actually regulate that, the word you use, right? We have to sort of work at it, I guess, piece by piece, and hope that people realize it. Is that?
Well, the goal is to try to convince the population, especially the population that is still amenable to logic and research and rationality, to try to convince the population. That's why education is so important. The sharing of expertise is so important. It's not to oppress, it's actually to strengthen and empower the population to be able to govern itself. And so we need to distinguish between pathology and rational choice, which, in normal human health encompasses a great range of human variation, a variety of thoughts and differences of opinion. These are all life-affirming because they are occurring in the realm of health, and we want that level of disagreement and debate from happening. But when we see signs of pathology, that is holding beliefs that are not amenable to any discussion, not amenable to facts and logic, this is actually going into the realm of pathology. And that's where intervention is necessary. And that's different from a fascistic intervention. It's intervening with the techniques that are known and proven by science to work and to facilitate freedom of thought to happen, and to allow for healthy discourse and protection of civil liberties and rights, not the other way around. Of course, the true fascists will argue that this is a fascistic intervention, just as they said this of public health measures against COVID, even though early and strong interventions in the beginning based on science would have given us far more freedom, economic assurance, and may have stopped the pandemic in its tracks long ago.
As we finish up, so is Yale, do you feel, fundamentally violating academic free speech at the core of what they did to you?
Well, that is my opinion, which is why I launched the lawsuit, and that is the opinion of many scholars of academic freedom and many First Amendment scholars, because its reasoning was that I violated the American Psychiatric Association's rule, when technically I did not violate it. I did not violate the principle of it. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association had, when it placed the privileges of a powerful political figure above our responsibility to public health, and declared all mental health professionals who are speaking up as unethical, when in fact the Goldwater rule, which it was basing this on, is a trade association rule. No other mental health association apart from the APA has it. And I myself was not a member of the APA. It's a voluntary association of a voluntary with a voluntary rule, and I chose not to subscribe to the rule. And yet, because the APA could not enforce it, Yale chose to enforce it, and that goes against every principle in what universities are.
Now let me ask this. Let me ask this more bluntly. Now, you write this tweet that offends Dershowitz, particularly getting close to his trying to keep himself away from the Epstein line of sight. Did Yale cave to that?
That I don't know. All I know is that my speech was consistent and particularly fierce, as you indicated. All the more that my profession was silent, I felt the duty to speak up. But the shift in Yale came only after Mr. Dershowitz's complaint. And he also has a track record of removing academics from their academic positions, from tenure, we don't know how he has that power, but he does.
All right, let us know now what you're doing next, because it's kind of interesting.
Yes. In fact, I was holding off on switching academic affiliations because I'm still waiting for Yale. I would like Yale to correct its course. I have a special attachment, affection for Yale, as I mentioned, and I feel that it's not isolated in its actions. It's rather a cultural shift in that we're no longer allowing people to voice inconvenient opinions, especially opinions inconvenient to power. But I've, of course, received a number of invitations since my dismissal from Yale became public. And so I have chosen to affiliate myself with Harvard Medical School and Columbia University, as Union Theological Seminary invited me to co-found an institute for violence prevention with many luminaries in the field. And I'm so honored and delighted at this opportunity. And I feel that really is the next stage in which we need to go. This being based in theological seminary has particular meaning for me. You may know that I have Masters of Divinity in addition to a medical doctorate. And I feel that it has come to be a problem not just of our mental health and psychology, but our societal problem is now a problem of our soul and spirituality. And that's where I wish to take the next level of discourse.
By the way, I read in the article that you said you had fasted for 40 days in searching for direction in your life. You found a linkage there?
Yes, it was after that fast that I decided to accept their invitation. All other invitations I would not have really considered because, in a sense, I've done much of this work, but what they were proposing was something new at the level of rigor that I was considering, that is to tackle the spiritual side.
All right. Well, I've always just admired your courage because you've taken a lot of grief for what you feel is a public service or a duty to warn, in your field's language. Trump's Mind, America's Soul, Profile of a Nation. Please consider my book, Madoff Talks, Uncovering the Untold Story Behind the Most Notorious Ponzi Scheme in History, available at Amazon, local bookstores, Walmart, and it will be a documentary in about a year. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll see you on the next edition.